Yesterday, I was sitting for and I was sitting for I just started and at one point I got Good. Can you hear me? Hurrah. Should we test that one as well? Hello, hello. Yeah. Hello. Oh. I'll see nodding. Welcome, everybody. This is so splendid to see so many of you have a proper crowd in the garden. So welcome to the second day of the Book Fringe. We've had one event today and this is our second for the day. I'm Jess and I'll just introduce you to our wonderful speakers today. I should also say, in case, I think Mary mentioned it before, but if you feel like you need to change seats at some point, please do. If you're more comfortable somewhere else, this is a very relaxed space. So please do make it your own. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here today with two amazing writers and thinkers. We've got, starting on that side, Rebecca Tamash, who used to live in Edinburgh, lovely retirement student country. So Rebecca Tamash's poetry and criticism has been published widely. She's the co-editor of Spells, Occult Poetry for the 21st Century, and her first poetry collection was called Witch, amazing book, and it was published by Pen in the Margins in 2019. She is a lecturer in creative writing at York St John University, where she co-curates the York Centre for Writing Poetry series, and is also the author of this amazing creature called Strangers, which came out 2020. I wasn't sure it was 2019 or 2020. 2020. And then we've got Adrian Fuller as well, who is a senior fellow at Commonwealth. It's a progressive think tank focused on building a democratic economy. Her research and writing have featured in The Guardian, The Financial Times, Bloomberg, and The New Statesman, among others. She's the co-author of Owning the Future, which we actually have copies of today, even though I don't think it's kind of out yet, but it's there. And also this amazing book, The Value of a Whale. So you've got two books out like pretty much at the same time. Yeah. Intense. Just a round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us. So I was trying, as I was thinking about how to kind of frame this conversation, because they are two very, very different books in many ways. And at the same time, I feel like my engagement with them, there is a great affinity there. And I was trying to think about where that is and why that is. And one of the things that I thought about was that for me, you're both writing about ways in which we need to, at this moment, liberate our minds. It's about intellectual and imaginative liberation, whether it is thinking beyond the non-human or also thinking about beyond capitalism, which you both write about. So I'm going to dive like straight into the at the deep end and ask you both if there's, in what ways are, liberating our minds from anthropocentrism and liberating our minds from capitalism, in what ways are those the same? Yeah. Oh, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Really bit louder. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. That's obviously a very big question, and I think there are many, different answers to it. But I do think that a lot of it actually has to do, in a way, with one of the main themes, I guess, of this conversation, which is this idea of growth. And I think when we're trying to understand the way in which kind of stepping away from anthropocentric ways of thinking is linked to capitalism, it's a really useful focus because, as I'm sure many of us are aware, how do you have capitalist growth on a finite planet? Those two things obviously have a huge kind of clash. But I think what's really, really important is to not just see it as an economic problem and not just see it as a resource problem, even though of course it is, because it's also about an attitude. And it's something that I think about a lot. To me, one of the things that makes capitalism so problematic is its obsession with control of all kinds, whether it's control of certain kinds of people from certain kinds of backgrounds, or whether it's a control of the natural world that turns something extremely complicated and alive and full of individual kind of beings into a resource. So I think it's about that way of turning kind of living, complicated, varying things into controllable resource. And I think that obsession with control is so deep in capitalism, but it's also so deep in all of us as well. As I say, it's not just an economic system, it's an emotional and internal framework. And I think stepping away from it and recognizing how, I think often people like to act as if capitalism is just some kind of practical system. It doesn't have, it's not about emotion, it's not about feeling, but actually it shapes our emotional landscapes. And I think being able to recognize that is maybe the beginning to sort of start working towards an equitable relationship with a non-human, if that makes sense. I don't know if that resonates with you. Yeah, very much so. I think the first thing I would say about sort of marrying those two ideas is that for me, I really respect the Anthropocene, I guess, as a framework, and I think it's done a lot in making us all think about our impact on the world. But the framework that I actually prefer, and which I sort of talk about in the book and in my work more broadly, is borrowed from a scholar called Jason Moore, who describes it more as the Capitalocene, because there's something quite universalizing about the idea of the Anthropocene in terms of, everyone has had the same kind of impact and the same kind of role in driving climate and ecological crisis, which we know to be sort of fundamentally untrue. This is profoundly an issue of inequality, both within and between countries. So I think being able to understand that requires us to understand, the inequalities inherent to capitalism, to understand, mankind's impact on the planet. And when it comes to control, again, I think that's a really astute point. And for me, the way that capital sort of exerts control over the planet and over people and spaces is through, and this is sort of a focus on the book, but through sort of the price mechanism and sort of trying to force absolutely everything we do, from elements of the natural world to human relations and interactions, into something that is compliant with the dynamics of markets and requiring a price to do that. So the book is called The Value of a Whale because, efforts have been made to arrive at what a reasonable dollar value would be for a whale. And so I think, that is how this control is exercised, and it becomes, so normalized in the way that we think through our daily lives, even the way that we justify anything, whether it's a decision a politician is making or whether it's a decision we make in our own lives, tends to be viewed through this prism of price and cost benefit analysis. And that's an incredibly sort of narrowing frame of which to understand kind of the world around us. I guess to some extent, and you talk about this in, well, actually, you both talk about this. You talk about this in The Value of a Whale in terms of everything being abstract, and that, assets like like the economy is incredibly abstract, and yet it depends on a material world. And that also made me think of your essay on pain, Rebecca, and how not in non-human bodies and women's bodies. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how much a return to material and actually bringing things back from the abstract at every turn can be part of resistance.
Yes, I think that's a really, really important point, and I think it connects very strongly to what Adrian was just saying in terms of turning everything into something with, for example, a dollar value. You know, and this is an idea that I also find myself quite obsessed with because of how it actually turns the material into the abstract. And I think the more that we kind of return to material, both in terms of kind of bodily experience, but also in terms of kind of what's actually in the world. I think in a funny way, that consumer adoption in its own way, and problematic in its own way, but I think the material doesn't just have to be about what's kind of there and you can grab onto. I think it also, for me, is very linked to individuality. It's very easy, you know, you use the example of On Tone, which is an essay in which I write about poetry and also kind of industrialized farming. Industrialized farming encourages us to see animals actually as an abstract concept, but as soon as you return to the body, instead of thinking about beef or cattle, you see an individual, for example, an individual chicken or whatever the farmed animal might be. And in returning to that materiality, you actually also return to agency, which I think is something that was very encouraged to be separate from in the ways that we think about the natural world, actually. And once we step back and look at the body again, we see all the things that come with that in the case of, you know, industrial farming, pain and cruelty and suffering. But it's also that individualistic, and it reminds us that there are individual beings out there with their own kind of minds and experiences. So I think the more that we can rematerialize, both in terms of human inequality and non-human inequality, I think the easier it might be to push back against some of that kind of abstract thinking.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two layers of abstraction that I focus on in the book, and one of which is sort of inherent to classical or mainstream economics, which is a perspective and a model that views the economy as sort of a distinct unit that is fundamentally kind of disembedded from the physical world around it. You know, nature and materials feature as an input, but the sort of impact of the economy on the natural world and the material world doesn't sort of feature in the way that we sort of calculate and understand economic relations and, you know, what our priorities are. You know, GDP growth is a really good example of that. You know, environmental destruction can be considered a positive from the perspective of GDP insofar as you might pay someone, pay a laborer to clean up that environmental segregation. So it's sort of by, you know, that abstraction, we've enabled a profoundly kind of irrational system. And so I think sort of re-embedding like I guess what's key is sort of like the complexity of the world in which it's embedded. So again, the idea that we can, you know, one of the ways that people have tried to resolve the very issue I just described is to say, okay, in order to stop destroying nature, then we need to have a price on it so that the cost of destroying it is reflected in market interactions. And then once we've done that, then the market will resolve that issue. The problem is that when we're dealing with like a complex ecological system, to put a price on specific elements is sort of fundamentally illogical. So the whale example is a big one of that. But you know, the systems being devised to do this, you know, there are things like ecosystem services or natural capital, which are basically schemes being drawn up to basically be able to attach price tags to different elements of ecologies and ecosystems that we value. But the methodologies for doing so are based around purely, you know, what is the economic value of this river? So it provides us with fishing and tourism and, you know, clean water, but, you know, it ignores any of the other values beyond that which immediately serve the economy. And so that can end up, when it's abstracted out in that way, being sort of very ecologically problematic because you focus only on preserving those elements which are valuable in an immediate economic sense, which means you disregard everything else about the sort of profoundly complex ecosystem in which it's embedded.
But that's so interesting, and I just want to add very briefly that I think that way of thinking also filters into some of the more sort of day-to-day relationships that we have with the natural world, because what it really makes me think about is the kind of problematic narrative of kind of wellness culture in terms of the natural world. That you have a situation in which it's not good enough for a space to exist because it's alive. You have to be able to prove that it has a benefit for the human. And that, by the way, that benefit isn't enough to just say, you know, I love that place. It means a lot to me. No. If you can prove that this person managed to come off their SSRIs, such a many because they went cold water swimming, then it has a value in terms of wellness, because then it's saving money for NHS. Or perhaps going into the forest, we can prove scientifically that these spores benefit or or serotonin or whatever. And it's not that fascinating and incredibly important. But what if they don't? Does that again mean that somehow it's cut off from this idea of human well-being that goes beyond finance? So just because we cut ourselves off from a comprehension of things that is economic, it doesn't mean we've escaped that kind of very controlling, capitalistic attitude in which everything has to have a teleological purpose to have a value. And I think it's embedded in so much of the way that we think.
Definitely, and that it makes me think of what you said earlier, Rebecca, about capitalism not being just a system, but being just so deeply embedded in how we think and actually how we see ourselves, our self-image, and how not only how we value others and more than humans, but how we value ourselves. And I wanted to ask you, with reference to, with regards to that, about growth. Growth is the idea that growth is good, is applied to so much. We grow as people, and that is a good thing. It's just almost like in the words themselves. So I wanted to ask, personally, like, what element of growth is most, or the idea of growth is most difficult for you to kind of challenge in life in general?
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, I think many things. I think, one thing that I think we might often, I'm in my 30s, it's often a time in which people look back on their unhealthy 20s and they think, better start doing a bit of exercise, better start thinking about nutrition, or whatever. Nothing wrong with that. You want to take good care of yourself. Right. To try and navigate questions like that without falling into the millions of traps, be they diet culture, be they ideas, fat phobia, colorism, whatever it might be. You trying to, for example, grow your health and well-being in a physical term, immediately you're falling into all these traps where growth is actually about how you present, about the kind of person you are to the outside, what you look like in a photograph, appearance stuff, which isn't really about you and how you feel about yourself. That's one thing, which I think is very difficult. But also, of course, I think it's, anyone who works in a creative kind of space, the pressure to grow in terms of your own work, I think, is also very difficult. You go into spaces because you want to communicate and you want to create. And of course, everything is put up in capitalism. So inevitably, there are certain pressures, often internal, to perform in a certain way, to sell a certain amount of copies of your book, even if it's not published by a big publisher or whatever it might be, because that is the narrative that we're swimming in. And so I definitely find that I have to kind of distance myself sometimes from the expectations which are ambient in terms of what success looks like, and trying to refocus on what really matters, which is, of course, that you've made a connection with one reader, two readers, that you've written meant something to them. Because obviously, inherently, that's why you write, that's why you sit down at your desk. But a lot of the structured narratives around us can actually make it hard to connect that. So that's definitely something that I struggle with at times.
What you?
I guess I come at it from the perspective of, I work in economic policy and try to think about how we could do things differently. And the biggest challenge that I have is just how, profoundly normalized and naturalized the positive valence of growth is, particularly in an economic and policy space. And but also, that sort of has distributed throughout all of society. So there's really interesting book by an academic called Kate Soper, and she cites a lot of research. She cites a lot of research that follows studies where they just present words to people related to growth or related to an absence of growth, and the valence that splits between inherently positive responses to those words versus a sense of lack, a sense of decline, a sense of grief. When talking about something that lacks growth, is incredibly sort of embedded in society. So that's a hurdle at the very beginning when you're trying to both design and then to sort of advocate for different types of economic thinking and policy, to just overcome that first barrier. And the second is to basically make the case for a radically different way of organizing our economy without lapsing into the growth frame. So even, you can think of what are probably some of the most progressive or radical policy proposals that exist in the public sphere. Now, they may have many limitations, but we'll just take AOC's Green New Deal as an example there. There are several instances in which, to justify
that program, she has to lapse into this will benefit growth in this way, doing X, Y, Z. And so you're already sort of like operating on the playing field of, you know, the person that you're, or the idea that you're fighting against. And those are constraints that you have to overcome even in the first instance. And the second is that, you know, we live within capitalism, we live under it, and it is a system in which without growth, you enter a state of decline and collapse and pain primarily for those at the bottom of the income sort of spectrum. And so that is this kind of hurdle in what I think is a necessary move towards a post-growth economy that is something that I struggle with in terms of just like the practical mechanics of how we get there, because the worst thing that, you know, the worst possible outcome would be that we begin to move away from that and penalize the people at sort of the hardest hit parts of the economy already. But that's sort of the fundamental nature of how capitalism operates without growth. And that's how growth continues to be so justified, because all you have to do is point to an economic recession in history and say, you know, look at who, you know, suffered the most under this and who, you know, came out okay. Like 2008 is a very clear indication of that. So that's a narrative that's really, really hard to fight with. It's also a practical step that's really hard to grapple with as someone who is thinking about the economics of achieving post-growth. And that's sort of one of the questions that kind of, yeah. I mean, it's so great to have you both here, because I feel like it's one of those examples of like we need so many different kinds of thinking and of work to come together. So I'm interested in hearing answers from you both about this. How beyond the pale is even the idea of degrowth still? Because I was thinking very specifically about the kind of climate justice work that I'm involved in at the moment, and like at the weekends, Climate Camp Scotland, and we were like protesting this so-called energy transition zone in Aberdeen. And, you know, a lot of, even within those movements, I think a lot of the arguments that are made is that, you know, we don't need these false solutions because the renewable energies is still there. But then the next step is like green colonialism. Like where are those materials going to come from? So it almost seems like degrowth is still this elephant in the room. And I wonder, I would like to hear your takes on that. Like, how difficult is it to even talk about less being good? Yeah, I think that's, so. I'm not technically like a scholar of degrowth, so I won't speak for their discipline as a whole. But what's interesting to watch slightly from the outside is there's been what I think is a very positive shift from a position of being broadly ignored by the mainstream policy and economic space to the sort of ridicule and ad hominem attack phase, which I think is a sign of progress in their sort of role in the debate. So on Friday, I think Paul Krugman, who's sort of a Nobel laureate, very mainstream economist, writes for the New York Times all the time. And he's now picked up a hobby of just tweeting ridicule of degrowth. And to me, that is a profoundly positive sign in terms of where we're getting in this debate. I think, yeah, degrowth remains, quite a challenge to have as, you know, a reasonable discussion in mainstream economic circles, because there is this inherent sense, and it is backed up, you know, by evidence that for a period of time, growth was on average and net very positive for people in societies that were previously marked by sort of much wider poverty. The problem is that that is inherently limited. So for a while, growth kind of does lift all boats, and then that very quickly tapers off. And that is where most sort of advanced or industrialized or whatever you want to term them societies are, where the more growth we have, the fewer returns to sort of human happiness and well-being we have, if not active sort of detrimental impacts on human well-being and thriving. But it's really hard to dispel the idea that for a while, GDP growth was correlated, if not directly causally related, to improvements in well-being. So you kind of get laughed out of the room a little bit when you begin to advocate for a post-growth kind of way of living, even though, you know, evidence now shows that it has, you know, no benefits past a certain level of, you know, average income for most people. Even though we know that when it comes to decoupling growth from emissions, you know, even when there are some examples of limited absolute coupling, they're nowhere near the kind of pace or scale needed to continue growing and stay anywhere within sort of close climate limits. And there's absolutely no evidence of absolute material resource decoupling from growth. And so confronted with those facts, there really is no alternative, not to accidentally quote Thatcher, that was a bit miserable, but there isn't. And so what's interesting to me is that there are two sort of really challenging pillars that have come up against each other, one of which is this embedded sense that growth and markets are the only way of being, and that, even if we don't believe in them necessarily as an ideal way to organize our society, that, this is the world we live in, and so the real politics should be, we have to engage with them and find a way to, advocate any kind of solution within those frameworks. Maybe anything is better than nothing, versus the fact that, ecological and planetary realities are on the other side of the room screaming at you that that isn't possible to do. One of these two forces has to shift. Both are incredibly immovable, but only one of them actually can shift, which is the politics and which is the way that we organize societies. And there's no way that that is easily done. However, it is the only one that can be transformed, because the ecological realities over on this side aren't going. I mean, I think Adrian has covered it so eloquently, but I think, there is, of course, the layer that Adrian's talking about. I think often, especially in the kind of mainstream political, and perhaps what I might call like the climate change fantasy, which is that if you can solve climate change specifically, then we can keep everything as normal. But of course, if you think about it for 1 second, even if tomorrow we have nuclear fusion and clean energy and yay, that would be great, but you still have the problem of natural resources, to use that kind of horrible word. That is climate. So it doesn't matter if climate change is no longer happening, you still have those issues. But then I think also something that, I'm aware of that really kind of comes across in these conversations as well, is that the way that degrowth is often understood is always within the context of loss and land. And I think it's so difficult, whether we're thinking about it in the way that Adrian has described, which is that obviously there has been, through GDP increase, some benefits for some people who are in absolute dire poverty, and of course those benefits should be retained and the benefits spread to people in poverty. So there's that fear, of course, but there's also almost a more existential or emotional fear that degrowth is about some kind of self-punishment, that you're going to take away the things that people like. And often, of course, this is not a critique of actually normal so-called people, it's a critique from the kind of privileged and powerful, and it's their perception of how normal people think, which is, people don't want you to take away their holidays, and people don't want you to take away their cars, whatever it might be. Now, that's not saying people don't love their cars, but inherently, one of the issues I think, and one of the things I think is quite actually exciting, as degrowth becomes a little bit more normalized, even if it's just that people making fun of it, is that you can start to push back not just with science, not just with economics, but with the kind of social and emotional and cultural options that you go through. Because to me, a degrown society is a much more joyful one, it's a much more generative one, it's one that is inevitably based on community and working with each other and sharing what we have. And that's not just so that the planet doesn't burn to a crisp, it's actually so that we have lives which feel resonant and full of meaning. And for me, that's a beautiful opportunity. You can only take it. And I think it's our responsibility, especially, perhaps those of us outside economics, and politics, to be able to tell those stories and to be able to say, this isn't about you losing, it's about you gaining, and actually everyone gaining, and that is there, but I think we perhaps haven't hopefully access that narrative as much as thanks for following up on that. Yeah, I think you've really hit, the critical point there, and that's a fight that sort of needs to be won. And the way that I think about it is the growth of the degrowth debate is to break it down into kind of the real utopias framework of Eric Owen Wright, which is, is it desirable, is it viable, and is it achievable? And one thing that growth or pro-growth and green growth arguments have to answer for is, even if this were achievable, is it desirable? And I think when it comes to things that most people actually value or care about or benefit from in their lives, whether that's, free time with your family, time doing things you care about, sort of basic material security, access to green spaces, thriving nature, health, all these things we care about, for most people, capitalism and growth don't deliver those things, or past a point seems to deliver more of them. And so even if we set aside the achievability and viability questions, I find it hard to argue that growth is in of itself desirable. And I think that is maybe the most kind of fertile ground for advocates of a post-growth way of living, which is, how can we think about a way to fundamentally reorganize the way we live that's much more rational, but also much more joyful, and also one in which, and this is sort of my passion project, I guess, but one in which freedom tends to be the position of advocates of markets and of capitalism, right? So we have freedom of choice, free markets, all these things associated with freedom. But really what we have is freedom to consume and to choose a bit what we consume. But other than that, we have limited freedom over our time. All of us sort of have to work as much as possible to survive under, a soaring kind of cost of living crisis, for example. And also the freedoms that we do have, at least in, the societies in which we're fortunate enough to live, is generally predicated on the profound unfreedom of many other people all around the world whose labor is exploited, whose land is dispossessed for our carbon offsets, and even within our own society, the kind of invisibilized labor of migrants, agricultural workers, for example. So I think a post-growth way of living offers a chance to consider a world of freedom that isn't based, it's collective emancipation rather than individualized kind of sense of freedom.
You mentioned advocates there, and you're like, the advocates for degrowth, and I wondered, it would be so interesting to think about who are those advocates and how can we all be those advocates, right? Because you're coming from the world of economics and you're coming from the world of the arts, where do those people need to come from? And to some extent as well, what I was thinking about was just how, and I say that as someone who, like, my mother was an economist, and like I never understood anything of what she was talking about. And I think there was a Swedish writer called Katrine Marsal who wrote a book a few years ago, which came from the 2008 financial crisis, and noticing that people had no idea what was going on, because the economy seems like this thing that so many of us just don't understand. So I guess it's two questions. One for you, Adrian, like, to what extent do we actually need to bridge that gap, and maybe bring down like economics from its pedestal in a way? And also, how can other disciplines and other worlds contribute to this greater understanding, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, economics absolutely needs to be sort of demystified and taken out of this realm of some kind of fancy world of numbers and models, because frankly, all of them are. But I think, when it comes to, at least in the initial stages, kind of advocacy of this radically different way of living and organizing societies, frankly, economics is a lost cause in terms of leading that kind of vanguard. I think we really need, and I really cherish the leadership of people working in the arts and literature, and people organizing in their communities, people running cooperatives, people who are doing steps of prefiguring alternative ways of living and organizing and relating to each other. And I think only following that and kind of like a mass kind of groundswell of support and sort of discontent, frankly, with the current way that we organize our lives, can economics follow in to provide some answers for how we might do that? Because even in my own work, even in this talk, you've heard me speak within, the language of conventional mainstream economics. I use the phrase natural resources, how grim. But, in order to engage with anyone who works in this field, you have to use that terminology and engage in that space. And so I think we'll inherently always be playing catch up until there is sort of a more social shift in mindset. And I mean, there I will turn to Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of answer that I want to give is obviously that we need advocates from everywhere, right? That we need every type of advocate. And I think that, something, when I was talking about this before the event, something I'm very, very interested in, kind of on a sort of personal level, something I'm working with a politics academic at York, is the idea of how we just sort of share deep growth among artists and writers. Not so that we run be cool. But obviously that doesn't have to be that. But I think it's part of what we need is that degrowth becomes part of the conversation when we think about the environment. There's so many art, if I'm thinking from the arts, a lot of people in the arts are very committed and interested in climate change and environmental issues, which is fantastic and a really important kind of shift. But often degrowth isn't coming into that conversation. And as I say, it's not about them sitting down and writing a specific poem about degrowth. It's the fact that degrowth can be part of the way to think about climate futures and environmental equality and possibilities. And I actually do think that it is that thing of sharing the conversation so that more people can engage in it. And it makes me think about, certain ideas which were perceived as absolutely off the wall, and which now are part of mainstream conversation, even if they haven't been achieved. For example, that would be the 4-day week. Or perhaps UBI, we don't have UBI, but this is something you'd be looking at if you kind of got this idea. And now it's being discussed widely. I think that can potentially happen through degrowth as well. It can be taken a bit away from ivory tower of economics. That's only going to happen if activist groups, community groups, artists all kind of enter into that conversation. So I agree it's really important. And of course, I haven't solved the question of how we best do that, but it's something I'm really kind of excited to get into a dialogue about with many others from many different places.
Is it something to do with feeling like you're allowed to, I suppose, as well as someone working in the arts? Because I feel like there is a sort of barrier there.
Definitely there is. And I think so often people in the arts have not maybe had good experiences with certain disciplines, be that or be that kind of economics, things like that certainly would not be my personal strength. So I think that that fear, of course, is benefits, these kind of really sort of stringent economic models, because it encourages you to feel that if you're a normal person, you can't think about these ideas because you don't have the background to do so. Kind of division that encourages people to feel that they can't own their own ideas. So I agree. I think we have to really do everything we can as people with an interest in degrowth to demystify it. Because actually, we're all shaped by the economy. We live in the economy. It shapes the kind of experiences that we have. But I agree. I think you're totally right. I think people need to be able to kind of grow and think with some ownership of those narratives for their own communities and their own kind of spaces.
That's so fascinating, so interesting. I wanted to ask you both, as two people who are documenting in different ways, but responding to the responses to the climate crisis, to the climate and environmental crisis, and looking at those responses critically and engaging with them. I wanted to ask you about that. When it's come up a few times, I feel like in the event yesterday and the event this morning, about how colonialism, both colonialism and capitalism, isolates us. And it is that divide and conquer thing that you were saying. And it's a part of colonialism that maybe doesn't get talked about as much. It's both expansion, but it's also, divide and conquer and isolating people. So in terms of that, in terms of individualism and the divide and conquer of colonialism, how are you seeing that play out in responses to the climate crisis, be it green capitalism and all of these suggestions for deals and in COP26, but also in the wider kind of climate movements? Maybe start with you.
Sure. I think individualization is absolutely fundamental to the idea of green capitalism, which I described in the book, which is that our response to climate and ecological crisis can be done in a way which does as little as possible to disrupt the ways that we currently organize our lives and societies. So really kind of clamping down on existing inequalities in power and the rugged individualism which we are meant to pursue our lives and our livelihoods. Doing everything we can to not engage with the need to disrupt those. So whether it's something like carbon offsets, or finding a way to use your pension funds sustainably, or sort of ethical kind of eco consumption in products. The answers that we're given tend to be solutions, that sort of placate individuals and make us feel as though, and I think it's a really legitimate
yearning or feeling as though you're able to do something else. It feels like such an overwhelming problem that those individualized solutions are incredibly compelling. And I really relate to that feeling as someone who, buys ethical toothpaste. I know, but I think we all relate to that feeling. But what is critical to me is not letting that sort of distract from what is an inherently sort of societal and systemic question. I described the book and I pitched it to my editor as radicalizing my mom, because I like to think of her as someone who is really well-meaning. She really, every time she gets a train or a flight or something, she asks me if she could offset it. And it's basically the goal is to try and re-embed. I feel like I've said the word embed 500 times today, but whatever. Re-embed kind of those responses in the fundamental question for me at the heart of climate and ecological crisis, which is inequality. And that is necessarily a societal and systemic issue. It's also an uncomfortable one for people in positions of political power to engage with, right? So most people in this audience, I'm sure, have seen kind of famous Oxfam graph that shows, top 1% of the population is responsible for half of global emissions and 10%. But the uncomfortable truth is that the top 10% of the global population is earning $38,000 per year. So we think of it as people in positions of extreme wealth within the framework of the society within which we live. But we need to engage with the fact that, beyond those extreme examples of, the fact that someone living in Nigeria consumes half as much electricity in a year as the average HDTV sitting on a wall in the United States. Those are extreme examples and they're true, but fundamentally, all of us are living lives that are sort of inherently unsustainable, not necessarily through our own choices, but through the society in which we exist. And so I think the critical question is to attach climate environmental issues to global and sort of intra-country inequalities, and to never sort of let that framework be divorced from the way that we respond to this issue. And that's exactly what sort of capitalism tries to do by giving us individualized solutions.
Yeah, I kind of want to sort of, again, circle around a point of inequality, just thinking about what you're talking about. There's so many ways to answer this question, but I think that if we're thinking about how potentially kind of problematic sort of capitalist and colonialist narratives can be reproduced, I think without, turning into a circular firing squad, I do think it is important to think about how those narratives are reproduced in the climate movement as well. Of course, and I think somewhere that I see it particularly is in, I guess, what I call apocalyptic thinking. And what I find really problematic, and there's particular people I could kind of, sort of pull out, and perhaps I will in a moment, but I think what I find, they're not here, it's fine, I can say what I want. But, there's this kind of apocalyptic strain of climate thinking, which I suppose I see most strongly in organisations like the Dark Mountain, which is started by Paul Kingsmith, but they are really by no means the only one, where often, and perhaps let's put Paul Kingsmith out of this, sometimes within climate apocalyptic sort of focus, there's a desire to scare people into action. And of course, I do sympathise with that desire. I saw recently a Twitter thread by one of the people that started Extinction Rebellion, and I was shocked because it was the most scaremongering thread of terror that I've ever seen. So the apocalypse is basically unavoidable. And the problem is I know that comes from fear and also desire to make change. But the problem with apocalyptic thinking is first, not just, it puts people off. It's much deeper than that. It acts as if we are all facing the same apocalypse. But to say the obvious, for people in the global south, for indigenous groups, often the apocalypse has already happened. Already your land has been destroyed. Already you've been, you shifted out of your home. Already you've been forced to become a migrant, whatever it might be. And so first of all, I have a massive issue with the totalizing nature of that apocalyptic language, because as I say, apocalypse has already happened for a lot of people, and a long time ago. Right? It didn't just happen. Okay, so there's that. But there's also the problem with it, because I think that often it falls into a desire for simplicity. Actually, it's funny, I'm writing something, I could go on about this too much, and I'm trying to restrain myself there, it's a bit of a hobby horse for me. But certain climate narratives, the ultimate example of this, God bless, is The Day After Tomorrow. The Hollywood eco film, don't get me wrong, that film is not trying to save the world, it's trying to be entertainment, so in a way it's not the greatest example for us to focus our critique on. But actually, people enjoy apocalyptic stories because they're simple. if we imagine that climate change is going to just wipe us all out in one big day of doom, that's obviously horrific and terrifying. But it's kind of, it's like, okay, I can sort of imagine that. I've read the road. I can kind of, you know, but in reality, that's not what it's going to be like. It's going to be a bunch of micro apocalypses that people with the least, the people in the global south, the people who already are suffering, the apocalypse will happen to them first. For some at the very top, it will never happen. It may, we don't know, right? But so I think this apocalyptic thinking is a desire for simplicity because the climate crisis is so unbelievably complicated, various and fractured. But I think we have to do everything we can within different areas of the climate movement to kind of push back against that thinking, because I think it's very numbing for a start, but I think also because it doesn't recognise the inequality that is already so present in those kind of sort of issues and experiences.
I have more questions, but time, so I think I'm going to open it up, and then depending on how many questions I have, I might try and squeeze in some more. Do we have any questions? First of all, in the yes, the hand straight up. Amazing. So I'm gonna. Oh, you're okay. Yeah, projecting. Yeah. I think we could all answer that. Yeah, sorry. So there was a question about whether or not degrowth can be achieved if we don't stabilize world population.
Well, I guess the point from which I would start there is that the relationship between sort of population and environmental impact is much less strong than the relationship between sort of wealth and income and resources and environmental impact. So I think, you know, first and foremost, the key to reducing humankind, we can use that phrase, sort of planetary and climatic impact is to resolve the question of how much we consume and waste, which is driven fundamentally by enormous kind of economic inequalities. And that's sort of the first and foremost point of order, I would say, I guess, in resolving that tension. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a huge amount out there, but I suppose that the other point I would make is that personally, I try not to actually engage in a focus on population, because I think it is distracting from the questions that we need to think about in terms of that. I would say that if that is something over which someone has an interest, then I think again we need to return to inequality, because as we know, how many children people have is very rarely a question of personal choice, and is very often to do with economic factors, be that to do with inequality between men and women, or be that to do with kind of economic strength or you know, wealth and so forth. So I think if we work towards less inequality, I'm not worried too much about the size of the population, but if that is something you're worried about, it will go down anyway. You know, and I don't think that, you know, as you say, I just don't think that that's necessarily something that we need to fixate on too much, because I think often, as you say, these are questions of consumption and equality, and once we address those, much else will come with it, I would say.
Yeah, no, I think those are really, really great answers. It's something that I've kind of been forced to talk about quite a lot over the years for various activist reasons. And what the only thing I would add really about that is that the population question and the population discussion very often leads to birth in itself being politicized and being weaponized as a tool for collective change and as a tool for something that is a systemic problem, as you were saying, of wealth and of inequality. And the consequences of that are always quite dire, whether it is towards the side of the spectrum of limited abortion rights, or whether it's at the other side of the spectrum where people and children we deem unwanted And groups of people, we deem unwanted are not seen as the people who should be having children, basically. So it comes back to that question of inequality, which is why, I think and this is not to say that we shouldn't be having those conversations, but I think we need to meet those conversations with in the way that is useful and in the context that they are happening, which is in the context of inequality, of huge world inequality. If that makes sense. Any other questions? And thank you for that question. Yeah, here up front. Right, so the question was about multidisciplinary response or an engagement with degrowth, and how do you see that happening both on an individual level and a collective level, and how do you see it sustained? Is that, yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. Again, obviously not one answer to this, but I definitely do think that actually a stronger sort of connection between the world of economic policy, academia, and the creative world as one element of that is really important, because I think often, as I've said, lots and lots of artists in different kind of realms are engaging with the climate crisis and environment, which is wonderful and important. But I think the truth is we're not going to see these things proliferate until we have like structured collaboration. So actually, I think we need to start thinking a little bit bigger about how those collaborations can take place. I work in academia, so that's the framework that I have. I mean, I'm a creative artist, so it's like, I'm a creative academic, but I do what I can. And we, because I'm in that sort of space, I'm like, okay, what can I do as part of an institution? Because here we have institutions which have artists in, like writers, theatre makers and so forth, and here we also have some economists and some politics people. Okay, great. So I'm going to use that institution to do what I can to bring people into conversation with each other, just so, as we discussed a lot today, dissemination is crucial. Like there's achieving, but before we even get to achieving, people have to know about degrowth and they have to be convinced that it might have a benefit for their community, right? So, but you don't have to be in a university to be I think whatever space you happen to be in, whether that's an activist space, an artistic space, a community space, you work in a business and you can maybe do something, because even businesses will kind of like, it's not really green this month or whatever. Maybe you can introduce the growth to part of that conversation or whatever it might be. So I think it's taking everything in front of us in the moment and just grabbing whatever we can.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think there's this kind of, again, sort of a almost intangible scale to like degrowth presented as an idea, because it's so radically different from what we currently do. It feels all encompassing, and therefore, how do you engage that in your daily life? But the sort of reality is that it's not going to be done as like a single, and now we are in the growth world. It's going to be a multitude of different kind of innovations and policies and actions and ways of community organizing that happen individually, as well as probably some kind of mass organizing or more top-down interventions necessarily. But a lot of that can be done in sort of much smaller scale discussions about, for example, reduced working time as something that we have stopped advocating for since we invented the weekend, and for some reason we've just given up on it. But that's something that would be fundamentally part of that kind of agenda, or at a workplace that is organized democratically, so that so everyone has sort of both a stake and a say in what you're doing, and what you're producing, and where the sort of benefits of that go and how they're distributed. These are all kind of small scale interventions that sort of add up to a different way of kind of living, and that can break down, I think, what feels like an overbearing kind of idea into a sort of much more manageable kind of daily piece of action. And all I'll say on interdisciplinary things is that economists are really bad at it. We like to ignore all other disciplines prolifically. And that is something that is hopefully changing. And what's been, I like to sometimes have little silver lining moments of hope, is that recently, if anyone reads the IPBES reports, join me there, to read about biodiversity. But they recently had sort of a summary of for the first time, an urgent need for the inclusion of non-mainstream economic perspectives in solutions to biodiversity, with reference to Indigenous perspectives, feminist perspectives, social sciences, arts, and all sorts of other questions coming into the resolution of this. And so I think while that's a baby step, it's a note in an article of one UN report. I do think that is an idea that is beginning to take hold, and we should absolutely seize that and push on it as hard as we can in every conversation that we have. Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? I feel like we've got a few minutes left, so we can. There was one arm there and then an arm there. Well, you're closest, so. Just to repeat the question for the live stream. So how we can communicate the benefits of degrowth on an individual level, whilst within the system that we're in, whilst at the same time kind of starting to work away from that system. Does that sound roughly like? Yeah, one of the, I mean, I don't know that I have a kind of nascent answer to this, because this is something that I struggle with every day consistently, basically. So as soon as you try, and you have really very little language for advocating alternative economic systems and ways of organizing that don't use those words, the words of sort of mainstream economics. And as soon as you try to avoid them, I find myself entering a space that to me feels very authentic, which is, let's talk about, the realms of freedom and our collective message, all these things, which I strongly believe in, but which, if you're trying to convince someone who doesn't agree with you and has a very different mindset, tends to kind of get a glazed eye, like this is just kind of wishy-washy, lovely, kind of lefty stuff. The one thing that I find has been quite helpful is to just return that kind of conversation to absolute bare basics, which is, what is the economy meant to serve? What is it meant to do? So, like, nuts and bolts, what is it that people need in their daily lives? What is it that people value? What is it they want to do the most and value the most? Each person will have a slightly different answer to that, but everyone has some kind of shared values and bases. And then you start from that point and say, is our existing way of life actually delivering that? Yes or no? Tell me how. And when you begin to break that down into, what is it in your life that you value? How is that being delivered or not at all? How does that apply to everyone else in your society? Who in society is lacking that? How many people and why? Then that conversation becomes much easier. Because again, kind of approaching it, I find, from a kind of broad brush issue is something that tends to provoke a very kind of knee-jerk reaction that Paul Krugman style tends to just ridicule and enter the kind of ad hominem space. So that's a work in progress for me, that kind of conversation. But that's something that I find quite valuable.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll only just kind of briefly add to that. It's a really interesting question. I think, again, to add to the kind of little jar of like sort of hope and little jar of silver lining, I think often even within a very capitalist system, people are less individualistic than those in power perhaps like to suggest that they are. And I think often, as Adrian is saying, if we return to the small things, if we return to the more tangible things, like, for example, in this country, we're talking about NHS, people are paying into it very different levels, depending on the different levels they pay. But actually, it's extremely rare, even at the top, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, for people to not want the NHS to be a pretty beloved national institution, as we all know. But there is a situation in which, something based on a kind of equitable, this is not just NHS growth, but an equitable, non-individualistic institution that actually is widely known, right? So actually, in people's daily lives, they do connect with a lot of things which are not kind of run on an individualistic basis, which they deeply value, either practically or or emotionally. So I think if we can kind of return his attention to those things and think, well, actually, these are the things which are giving you value in your life. And actually, I don't even think that consumption, so rarely you actually find something when it comes down to like brass tacks. It's like, yes, the thing that gets me up in the morning is the fact that I just like bought a new car. And again, I'm not trying to suggest that I have deep emotional relationships to possessions, etc. But like that represents something else. It's all emotion, really. It's all emotion. It's all about the car, right? It's about how it makes you feel. But other things to make you feel other ways also good. It's being able to, I think, have a confidence to speak on an emotional level. I think we're very fair to that. And actually, again, not to get into something else, but I think the fact that we avoid emotional political conversations has led to absolutely so many elements. Oh, well, of course, we're not going to vote for Brexit because practically, sadly, a practical decision, it's an emotional decision, right? So we need to actually get to talk emotionally about these questions. And actually, I think if we do, we'll win. I think deep growth will make people happier. It's about being able to have this conversation. I hope that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, yeah, we're gonna take one more.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. It's been wonderful. And maybe my question is mostly towards Adrian. I haven't read your book yet because it hasn't arrived yet, but it might be in the book, the answer. But in my collective, we talk quite a lot about this distinction of, like, in the kind of setting of eco-philosophy, on like whether you have to define things to protect them and whether the risk of like kind of the anthropocentrism is the losing of human responsibility. So partly this is kind of like ontological question, but partly it becomes a very practical question, like with the ecosystem services and things like that. Like, do you have to price things to protect them? But also, do we need an ontological difference between culture and nature to like protect it? And there is some very well-meaning eco-philosophers who think we need the division to protect it and to own up to our responsibilities. And surely we have to do something about this climate crisis. Yeah, we've talked about it a lot, and I can kind of see already where you must be coming from in this discussion, but I wondered if you can say something about it.
Yes, I'm not a philosopher, but I will do my best. And so I think the last chapter of the book does engage with this a little bit, right? Which is something we touched on before in this discussion, which is like that urgent feeling for anything to be done to address the crisis that we're facing. And natural capital, for example, is a really good example of that, where there are quite a few quite progressive and like very wonderful economic thinkers. Herman Daly is an example. If anyone knows him, highly recommend. Interesting post-growth thinker, but he actually comes down at various points in his writings over his career in favor of natural capital, for example, as a framework for this very reason, which is, it could provide us with the means of understanding, exactly how much we have destroyed and, for whom that matters. So if you think about extraction of nature and resources, to use that phrase, from the global south, for example, to benefit communities elsewhere, it provides a means of us understanding and rationalizing and therefore acting on that. And so it is quite a live debate, even among the kind of progressive space. I come down on the side, ultimately, that setting the kind of ontological question aside, when it comes to sort of putting a price on nature, for example, in order to say that, while I think, for some people that instinct is rational, it comes up quite quickly against the practical question of how you would actually do that. So, yeah, even if we set aside the kind of inherent kind of ickiness that I think a lot of us feel about, what is the dollar value of the whale, setting that aside, actually sort of pragmatically doing that ends up becoming sort of ecologically nonsensical. And so I tend toward kind of resisting it as a framework, because we tend to, disaggregate this phenomenally complex world in which we live into kind of discrete units necessarily in order to do that in a way that is not actually compliant with the way that those kinds of ecosystems and our climate kind of work and interact. And so I think fundamentally it is kind of a practical impossibility to do so.
which probably isn't hugely satisfying for philosophical question, but is a handy way of sidestepping it. But yeah.
I'll quickly try this one. I think it's a really good question. I wish I had more time to go into this, but I think something that I'm very interested in my own writing is actually not just the everything crucial that Adrian is describing in terms of actually how impractical and illogical it is to try and put dollar value on the natural world, but also how it misses out two things. One, the fact that things have a right to be alive simply because they exist, right? And that's a philosophical position, but it would be my own. And that even if it has literally no physical benefit to human beings, which is unlikely, but I guess there might be something out there which doesn't benefit us in some very indirect way, well, it still deserves to exist, right? Because it's alive. We don't get to decide what should exist, okay, one. But two, to completely paradoxically disagree with my comment, even that thing which does not physically materially benefit us, I would say does benefit us emotionally in terms of how we experience life. We cannot resonate within our own lives and find meaning, in my opinion, without the friction with the other. Otherwise, we live in a bland, smoothed out, kind of padded cell of the human, where the only thing we experience is the human. And I don't believe in human beings, whatever, because you get into kind of ridiculous arguments about that. But it seems to me that we are creatures that exist within the ecosystem of other beings and things which are alive. And that's how we started out as human beings. And it's very unlikely that we will emotionally survive without being part of that set. It doesn't mean that we're all the same. The opposite. It's that very different, it's that very friction, it's that very otherness that we can never fully understand, which benefits us because it creates a world in which there's mystery and there's openness and there's unpredictability. And that's actually the real world. That's our world. And I think the more we step away from it, the more unhappy and miserable we are. And I think that's one of many, many, many reasons that capitalism makes such unhappy populations. Of course, the other than inequality and cruelty and so on. And I do think it's a really important one. And I think when we start putting dollar values on things, we lose that really important kind of thread of connection. I think you are interested in that. The best person who writes about that is Byung-Chul Chan, the German trained philosopher. And I think he actually talks about this in a way that is a million times more eloquent than what I've just said. So if that is something you're interested in, Byung-Chul Chan, yeah, great guy, big fan.
You do have a beautiful phrase in your book, though, Rebecca, at one point, which is something about loving something that won't love you back, which really stuck with me. Thank you so much, both. Just a huge round of applause. Thank you so much.